Dear listener, 400 feet above the street, the city always looked manageable. Noise flattened into a distant hum, traffic lights blinked in orderly rhythm, and the river cut a calm silver line between concrete and glass. From the operator cab of the tower crane, I could see 6 miles in every direction on a clear day. Elevation doesn't just change your view. It changes your confidence. I had been running cranes for 11 years, long enough to trust steel more than people. The one I sat in now was bolted into the skeleton of a 42-story high-rise that would never be finished. The mast climbed straight through the center core, anchored to poured concrete at 5 intervals. The horizontal jib stretched out over the street like a rigid arm, counterweights balanced perfectly against the operator cab. Every bolt had torque specs. Every weld had a tolerance. Up here, things obeyed physics. Down below, they were starting to obey something else. The first sign wasn't sirens. Sirens were normal. Downtown had them day and night. It was the traffic that felt wrong. Mid-morning on a weekday should have meant steady flow, delivery trucks in the curb lanes, buses pulling clean arcs around corners. Instead, I watched cars stack unevenly at intersections, inch forward, then stop without cause. Some drivers abandoned lanes entirely, cutting diagonally across yellow lines like rules had thinned out. I adjusted the boom slightly, lowering a pallet of rebar onto the 12th floor deck. My radio crackled in my ear, but it wasn't sight chatter. Someone had left a local news station, running through the portable unit in the cab below mine. Words filtered upward through static. Containment, unknown vector, stay indoors. They sounded rehearsed, calm in a way that felt strained. Height teaches you to scan patterns. Wind direction. Load swing. Pedestrian movement. From 400 feet, patterns below were breaking. Clusters formed on sidewalks where there should have been flow. People stood too close, phones out, heads tilted in the same direction. A delivery truck stopped mid-block and didn't move for 15 minutes. I told myself it was another false alarm. We had plenty. Storm warnings that dissolved into drizzle. Transit strikes that lasted a weekend. The city always reset. Concrete cures. Steel rises. Life resumes. But around noon, one of the laborers climbed up the interior ladder into the mast housing below my cab. His breathing hit me before his words did. "They shut the hospital down," he said. "My sister works there. Said they're moving patients to the upper floors and locking the entrances. Hospitals don't move patients upward unless the ground level is compromised." I looked past him, out through the angled glass. 2 ambulances were wedged at an intersection 3 blocks south. Neither was moving. A bus sat sideways across a lane like it had been turned abruptly. People ran around it, not away from something visible, but away from something understood. From up here, panic looked like vibration. Sudden bursts of movement, then stalling. I rotated the cab slightly and scanned farther west. Smoke rose from a parking garage entrance. Not thick, not black, just enough to say something had been set or left burning. The laborer asked if I was coming down early. I looked at the ladder hatch beneath my feet. 400 feet of enclosed steel rungs inside the mast. One way up. One way down. "Not yet," I said. He hesitated, then climbed back down. Alone again, I turned off the news feed and listened instead to the wind sliding across the boom. Steel doesn't lie. It hums when stressed. It creaks before it fails. The crane beneath me felt steady, balanced, obedient. Below, balance was shifting. By late afternoon, the traffic lights continued their rhythm, but drivers ignored them. Cars bumped fenders at intersections and stayed pressed together. No one stepped out to argue. They just leaned on horns that blended into one long metallic wail. From 400 feet, it was obvious before it was announced. The city wasn't stopping. It was jamming. And anything that jams eventually locks. By the next morning, the pattern wasn't just broken. It was gone. The streets beneath the crane no longer flowed. They accumulated. Cars filled every lane in every direction, pressed bumper to bumper until intersections became solid grids of steel. Delivery trucks angled sideways where drivers had tried to force openings. Doors hung open in some vehicles. Others idled until fuel ran out, then sat silent with hazard lights blinking weakly against daylight. Gravity still worked. That was the only constant. From 400 feet, I watched people abandon their cars and attempt the sidewalks. They carried backpacks, grocery sacks, laptop bags, whatever had been within reach when movement stopped. Some moved quickly. Others drifted as if unsure where safety actually lived. Elevation turned chaos into geometry. You could see which direction the panic leaned before the people on the ground felt it. The site superintendent called over the job channel around 9 a.m. His voice sounded smaller than usual. "We're shutting down. Everyone cleared out. Lock what you can." "What? Clear out to where?" The question hung in the silence after he signed off. 2 ironworkers made it halfway up the mast ladder before deciding they weren't coming to relieve me. They shouted that the bridges were closing and that something had happened at the transit station. I didn't ask what. The details didn't matter. The effect was already visible. Smoke columns appeared in 3 separate neighborhoods by noon. Not coordinated. Not industrial. Small fires left unattended. When emergency vehicles tried to push through traffic, they made it only a few car lengths before stalling against the jam. Sirens rose and died in place, trapped inside their own urgency. Up here, the crane remained indifferent. The counterweights didn't care about infection rates. The mast didn't respond to the rumor. Steel waited for load instructions and nothing else. That contrast settled in my chest heavier than the air. Around midday, the radio picked up a clearer signal. Not the usual newsroom cadence. This was an emergency bulletin repeating on loop. Avoid contact, remain indoors, do not approach anyone exhibiting violent or erratic behavior. There was a word they used once and then avoided afterward. It slipped through static and lodged in my head. Containment failed. By early afternoon, the construction site below emptied entirely. Hard hats lay abandoned near the concrete pump. A forklift sat with its forks raised halfway, key still in the ignition. Someone had dropped a thermos near the elevator shaft opening. The building itself became hollow, just concrete rebar and the crane bolted through its spine. I rotated the cab and scanned north. A group of people were running across an intersection, not away from fire, but away from another group moving slower behind them. The slower ones didn't scatter when struck. They didn't protect their heads. They absorbed impact and kept moving. The ground had changed its rules. I looked down the length of the mast beneath me. 400 feet of vertical steel, with a ladder sealed inside it. Access required intention. Climbing demanded effort. There were no crowds up here. No sudden impacts. No stampede risk. But there was also no easy exit. Gravity doesn't negotiate. If the ground became hostile, descent would mean committing to it fully. There would be no halfway retreat once boots hit pavement. Every rung I climbed down would be a step into density. The wind shifted slightly from the west, bringing a new sound up the shaft. Not sirens, not horns, screaming, high-pitched at first, then cut short, then replaced by something duller, like bodies striking metal. I closed the radio entirely and leaned back in the seat. From this height, you could see the boundaries of trouble expanding in rings. Blocks went still one by one, not because people had left, but because movement changed character. The crane did not sway. It stood centered, anchored, elevated beyond immediate reach. Traffic had stopped. Gravity hadn't. And from where I sat, it was clear that anything still tied to the street would eventually be swallowed by it. By late afternoon, the choice wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't about caution or optimism. It was geometry. Everything alive was compressing toward ground level, and everything violent was following that compression. Streets had become funnels. Sidewalks were corridors with no exits. Elevators were useless. Stairwells were traps waiting to be sealed from below. Height wasn't comfortable. Height was separated. I ran through the alternatives with the same discipline I used when calculating lift loads. Option 1, climb down, get into my truck, try to outrun gridlock already visible for miles. Impossible. The streets were locked tight. Even motorcycles were boxed in. Option 2, shelter inside the unfinished building core. 42 floors of exposed concrete and rebar, dozens of access points, no secured doors. Too many angles. Too many blind spots. Option 3, stay where I was. The crane wasn't designed as a shelter, but it had 3 advantages nothing else offered. First, elevation. 400 feet meant distance from immediate threats. Second, visibility. From this height, I could see movement before it reached me. Third, singular access. The mast ladder ran straight through the center column in a narrow enclosed shaft. One way up. One way down. Control the ladder, control the approach. I climbed down into the mast housing and inspected the ladder system carefully. Galvanized steel rungs welded at regular intervals. Rest platforms every 80 feet. Safety cage intact. The lowest section extended down to a locking hatch, the building's mechanical floor. If I removed that lower segment, the remaining ladder would begin more than 20 feet above ground level. No casual climber could bridge that gap without equipment. Cutting access meant committing. I descended all the way to the base, moving faster than I should have. The building felt wrong now, too quiet, too open. The wind moved through unfinished window frames without resistance. I grabbed what I could carry in one pass. 2 cases of bottled water from the break area, a tool bag with a portable angle grinder, spare gloves, a first aid kit, 3 heavy tarps, a coil of rope, a headlamp, and the emergency radio from the site office. No time for perfection. Just essentials. On my way back toward the mast hatch, I heard movement on the street below. Metal striking metal, glass breaking. A voice yelling for someone named Daniel. I didn't look over the edge. The decision was already forming. Back inside the ladder shaft, I climbed 20 feet and paused at the first rest platform. From there, I lowered the tool bag by rope, clipped myself to the safety rail, and began unbolting the lowest ladder extension. The angle grinder screamed in the confined steel column, sparks cascading down the shaft. The sound would carry. That thought tightened my chest, but speed mattered more than silence now. The final weld snapped under pressure, and the bottom section dropped the remaining feet to the concrete below with a ringing crash. I hauled the loose segment upward with the rope and secured it across the platform beside me. When I looked down, there was nothing but empty air between the mechanical floor and the next reachable rung. 400 feet had just become a moat. I climbed back to the top with steady hands, counting rungs in sets of 20 to slow my breathing. At the operator cab, I locked the interior hatch and pulled the secondary steel brace across it. I shut down non-essential power systems to reduce visibility from below. Then I stepped out onto the machinery deck and looked down the length of the mast. The ground was still there. The city was still there. But it no longer had direct access to me. Distance had weight. Separation had rules. For the first time since the sirens started, I felt something close to control. I had not escaped the collapse. I had risen above it. And unless I chose otherwise, I was not coming back down. The crane had never been meant to hold a life, only weight. Motors, cables, counterweights, and steel housings filled the machinery deck beneath the operator cab. Open grating flooring allowed wind to pass cleanly through. That was good for stability. Bad for warmth. If I was staying, exposure would kill me long before anything climbed. I started by inventorying space. The machinery deck wrapped around the central mast in a tight rectangle no larger than a small studio apartment. The operator cab projected slightly off one side, enclosed in glass and aluminum framing. Behind it, hydraulic lines ran along the interior walls, feeding the rotation motor and hoist drum. There were anchor points everywhere, designed for maintenance crews clipping harnesses during service checks. Those anchors would become structural fasteners. First problem, wind. At 400 feet, the wind never stopped. It didn't howl constantly, but it moved with intent. Even a moderate gust at street level translated into steady pressure up here. I unrolled the first heavy tarp and stretched it across the open grating along the windward side, securing it with zip ties and spare bolts from the tool bag. The tarp snapped violently at first, straining against its bindings, but once tensioned tight against the steel railing, it reduced the crossflow enough to feel a difference. Contrast was immediate. One side of the deck remained exposed, cold air slicing through boots and jacket sleeves. The sealed side dulled the edge. Not warm, just survivable. Second problem, flooring. The metal grating underfoot allowed snow, rain, and debris to pass through. That was good during operation. Now it meant no insulation. I dragged 2 plywood sheets from a materials cache I had hauled up earlier and laid them across the inner portion of the deck, bolting them down through existing holes. On top of that, I layered 1 tarp, then a folded insulation blanket from the cab emergency kit. It wasn't a room yet, but it was a defined zone. Third problem, access control. The hatch connecting the ladder shaft to the machinery deck was heavy but simple. A sliding latch on the inside, no reinforcement. If something reached that height, unlikely but not impossible, I needed more than factory hardware. I used the removed ladder segment to fabricate a cross brace, cutting it down and bolting it horizontally across the hatch frame. Now, even if someone forced the internal latch, they'd hit solid steel before entry. I stepped back and looked at the shape taking form. The crane was still skeletal, but one corner had begun to resemble containment rather than equipment. From the edge of the deck, I scanned the streets below. Fires burned in scattered pockets. Smoke drifted upward in thin gray ribbons. Movement had changed character again, less frantic, more predatory. Small groups navigated between stalled vehicles, testing doors, striking windows. The ground felt unstable in ways elevation never did. Up here, every adjustment had a measurable impact. Tighten a bolt, reduce sway. Seal a tarp, reduce airflow. Action led to predictable outcome. Down there, action dissolved into reaction. I returned to the machinery housing and examined the rotation motor casing. Its steel shell retained heat slightly longer than open air after sun exposure. If I insulated the immediate perimeter, residual warmth could be trapped during the coldest hours. I wrapped the spare canvas around the base and secured it loosely, careful not to obstruct ventilation ports. The sun dipped lower, casting the boom's shadow long across the trapped traffic below. Light discipline would become critical after dark. Any visible glow from the deck would mark my position. I tested the cab lights, then shut them down entirely. From now on, illumination would be minimal and internal. As wind pressed against the new tarp barrier, it flexed but held. The crane swayed gently, a reminder that I wasn't anchored to bedrock but to structure. Movement was constant, even if subtle. The machine room was no fortress yet. It was a compromise between exposure and enclosure. But it was mine. And unlike the city beneath me, it was still under control. Cutting the ladder had given me separation, but separation without supply was just delayed failure. I had water for a few days, and whatever food was left in my backpack. That wasn't survival. That was a postponement. If I was committing to 400 feet, I needed one final controlled descent before the city hardened completely. I waited until dusk. Movement below had thinned, not because it was safer, but because visibility had dropped. I removed the steel brace from the hatch and clipped into the ladder shaft with my fall arrest harness. The empty 20-foot gap beneath the lowest rung forced me to lower myself carefully by rope before touching the mechanical floor. Every second down there felt heavier than it should have. Sound echoed differently now. Less traffic, more isolated impacts, distant shouting cut short too quickly. The site office had been stripped of obvious valuables, but emergency stores remained overlooked. I loaded 2 more cases of bottled water, a box of protein bars from a vending machine I pried open, a pack of contractor-grade trash bags, duct tape, hand sanitizer, disinfectant wipes, and a sealed bucket of quickset cement. Sanitation wasn't optional in a confined space. Infection from waste would be quieter, but just as lethal as anything on the street. I moved through the unfinished lobby cautiously, keeping to shadowed sections where exterior light didn't frame my silhouette. A pickup truck sat abandoned near the entrance, its bed filled with insulation bats still wrapped in plastic. I dragged 3 bundles inside, cutting the packaging open only enough to compress them for hauling. Insulation would matter more than extra calories if the temperature dropped fast. Each load had to be raised through the ladder shaft manually. I secured a pulley line at the first rest platform and climbed to guide the cargo upward. Water cases first because weight mattered. Then insulation. Then food. Then sanitation supplies. The rope burned against my gloves as I hauled. Every scrape against the steel shaft sounded louder than it probably was, and twice I froze when something struck metal outside the building. On the final lift, while pulling up the cement bucket, I heard a new sound directly beneath the mast. Slow, irregular movement. Not coordinated. Not mechanical. I leaned over the platform edge and looked down the length of the dim shaft opening. A figure stood at the base, head tilted upward. It didn't climb. It simply waited, as if calculating distance. I didn't wait to study it. The last of the supplies cleared the rest platform, and I climbed back to the machinery deck without hesitation. Once inside, I reinstalled the steel brace across the hatch and secured the internal latch. The ladder below remained incomplete. 20 feet of clean air separated me from ground reach. I sorted the supplies methodically. Water stacked along the inner mast wall. Food divided into ration units and logged with a grease pencil on a scrap of plywood. Trash bags designated for waste containment. Sanitizer and wipes stored near what would become the hygiene corner. Insulation tucked along the tarp-sealed wall to trap residual warmth. Then I took the removed lower ladder segment and carried it to the edge of the deck. With steady hands, I pushed it outward and let it fall. It struck concrete below with a metallic crash that echoed between buildings. The figure at the mast base jerked at the sound, then stumbled sideways as if confused by gravity's sudden punctuation. There would be no restoring that ladder. 400 feet was no longer a temporary advantage. It was isolated by design. I stood at the edge of the deck as darkness settled fully over the city. Fires glowed in scattered blocks, but most of the grid had gone black. The crane swayed gently, balanced and patient. Below, the ground tightened into something unpredictable. Above, I had water, insulation, sanitation, and food. The descent was over. From here forward, everything would be built upward. Water does not forgive mistakes. At ground level, you can scavenge. At 400 feet, you engineer. The bottled cases I hauled up were temporary insurance, nothing more. If the city below remained hostile for weeks, I would need a renewable source that didn't require descent. Elevation collects weather differently. Wind accelerates. Rain shifts sideways. Snow clings where it shouldn't. That instability could be converted into supply. The crane boom stretched nearly 200 feet out over the street. Its flat steel spine caught precipitation before anything below. I secured a secondary tarp beneath a segment of the boom using maintenance anchor points and angled it slightly toward the machinery deck. The goal wasn't perfection. It was captured. Rain or melting snow sliding down the boom would strike the tarp and funnel toward a collection point near the mast. I cut a narrow slit at the tarp's lowest corner and attached a short section of flexible conduit as a spout. That spout fed into a 5-gallon container anchored to the mast with ratchet straps. Gravity did the rest. Every storm would now leave behind something measurable. Condensation offered a quieter source. The operator cab, sealed in glass, trapped daytime warmth even during cold air. At night, interior surfaces cooled and moisture formed along the frames. I lined the lower edges with strips of absorbent cloth and positioned shallow trays beneath them. It wasn't much, but in isolation, small gains compound. Collection meant nothing without purification. I designated one corner of the deck as the treatment zone. A steel bucket served as a boil chamber over the portable propane unit, but flame had to remain controlled and brief to avoid drawing attention. During daylight, when ambient city noise still masked minor sound, I boiled collected water in small batches, then transferred it into sealed containers marked with charcoal lines to track usage. Sanitation required equal precision. A confined deck without a waste plan becomes unlivable in days. I converted one of the heavy contractor buckets into a sealed latrine system using double trash bag liners and a tight-fitting lid. After each use, a measured amount of absorbent insulation fiber and disinfectant was added to reduce odor and bacterial spread. Full liners would be tied, sealed, and stored temporarily in a secondary container. Disposal required risk management. During the quietest pre-dawn hours, when wind noise was highest and street movement lowest, I lowered sealed waste bags via rope to a designated drop zone clear of the mast base. Distance was critical. The crane's stability depended on keeping weight distributed properly, and I refused to allow accumulation beneath me that could alter footing or attract attention. Hygiene extended beyond waste. I rationed sanitizer carefully and established a strict protocol. Hands cleaned before touching food, after touching rope or steel, after adjusting insulation. Small abrasions in a high-exposure environment invite infection. Infection invites fever. Fever invites mistakes. Contrast sharpened daily. Below, the movement grew more erratic, less organized. Figures drifted between cars with no visible objective. Above, routine solidified. Collect, boil, seal, record, discard. By the end of the first week, the system stabilized. Bottled water remained untouched, except for emergency reserve. Melted snow and rain collection filled the daily requirement. Waste disposal followed the schedule. The deck no longer felt improvised. It felt regulated. 400 feet above collapse, survival was no longer about fear. It was about maintenance. And maintenance, unlike panic, responds to discipline. Cold moves differently at 400 feet. It doesn't creep. It strips. Wind funnels along the boom, hits the mast, and wraps the machinery deck in constant pressure. Even with insulation packed tight against the tarp walls, the temperature dropped fast after sunset. Water froze at the rim of collection trays. Breath hung in pale clouds that lingered too long. Heat was no longer comfortable. It was structural. The portable propane heater I'd hauled up during my last descent was rated for enclosed job site trailers, not open-air decks. Used incorrectly, it would fill the space with carbon monoxide before I felt warmth. Used carelessly, it would broadcast light and sent down into the streets. Fire attracts attention, even from things that don't understand flame. I set the heater inside a shallow steel tray positioned near the mast, not the outer tarp wall. The mast core retained some residual heat from the day's sun exposure, and placing the unit there allowed warmth to radiate inward rather than outward. I installed a narrow wind baffle using scrap sheet metal bolted between anchor points, creating a controlled airflow corridor. Exhaust gases needed escape, but light spill needed containment. The first ignition was deliberate. I opened the propane valve halfway, struck the igniter, and watched the small blue flame catch. No roaring flare. No sudden burst. Just steady combustion. I crouched at eye level with the heater for a full minute, monitoring flame stability and listening for irregular hiss. Then I stepped back and observed the tarp seams. No glow leaked through. That mattered more than temperature. I kept the burn cycle short, 15 minutes at a time, 3 times per night. Between cycles, I relied on insulation layers and body heat retained within the smaller sealed zone. The plywood flooring trapped warmth surprisingly well once heated. I shifted the water containers closer to the mast during cold spells. Liquid mass absorbs and releases heat slowly, stabilizing the immediate air. Below, fires burned openly in scattered buildings. They flared without discipline, feeding on whatever caught. Smoke columns rose thick and black, visible even in dim light. That was uncontrolled heat, destruction mistaken for survival. Up here, flame was rationed like water. During the second night of consistent cold, wind speed increased sharply. The crane swayed within its engineered tolerances, but insulation panels shuddered against their bolts. I reinforced the windward tarp with additional tie-down points and tightened every ratchet strap. Then I repositioned the heater slightly inward, prioritizing stability over efficiency. Mid-burn, I caught movement at the edge of my vision. A faint flicker below reflected light not my own. I moved to the deck railing and scanned downward. Several figures clustered near the base of the crane, drawn not by my flame, but by one of the larger building fires across the street. They moved unevenly, arms hanging at odd angles, occasionally colliding with stalled vehicles. None looked up. Height still granted invisibility, but heat could change that equation. I shortened future burn cycles and shifted them to coincide with peak ambient noise hours, midday wind gusts, distant structural collapses, moments when the city itself masked small anomalies. Carbon monoxide remained the silent threat. I installed a battery-powered detector near the sleeping area and tested airflow before each ignition. Safety in isolation requires paranoia. Every variable must be measured twice. By the end of the week, the system found rhythm. Burn, seal, retain. Rotate water containers. Adjust insulation. Log fuel consumption. Below, chaos spread without pattern. Above, warmth obeyed schedule. Fire did not make me visible. It made me deliberate. And deliberate heat, like deliberate height, could mean the difference between surviving winter and becoming another frozen shape at street level. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing at street level acknowledged the crane. Movement passed beneath the mast like water flowing around a rock. Figures drifted between stalled cars, occasionally colliding, occasionally striking metal with blunt persistence. The height advantage held. I watched them. They ignored me. That changed the morning the vibration began. It wasn't loud, just a faint, irregular tremor through the mast, different from wind sway, different from thermal contraction. I froze where I stood, one hand on the insulation seam near the windward tarp. The tremor repeated, sharper this time, followed by a metallic clang that traveled straight up the central column and into the soles of my boots. Something was striking the base. I moved to the inner edge of the machinery deck and crouched near the mast opening. Looking directly down 400 feet wasn't useful. Perspective compresses at that distance. Instead, I listened. Another impact. Then a scraping sound, slow, uneven, dragging against steel. I clipped into the safety rail and leaned just enough to gain a clear line of sight through the gap between tarp and mast. 3 figures stood at the crane's base. One circled the mast slowly, hands brushing the steel as if mapping it. Another struck the lower axis, hatch repeatedly, with an object I couldn't identify. The third simply stared upward. It wasn't random movement. It was orientation. For the first time since I cut the ladder, something below was attempting to understand the structure. I stepped back and reviewed the access point mentally. The lowest reachable rung now hung 20 feet above ground. No debris beneath it. No scaffolding nearby. But the base of the mast included bolted maintenance brackets and small steel protrusions that could be used as footholds if someone, or something, committed to climbing. The next vibration came sharper, followed by the distinct sound of steel-on-steel friction. I returned to the edge and watched as one of the figures jumped, fingers catching a bracket near the mast seam. It hung there, legs kicking awkwardly, then dropped. The second attempt lasted longer. Height was not immunity. It was maintenance responsibility. I moved quickly. From the supply pile, I retrieved the weighted steel rod I had repurposed from the removed ladder segment, a 6-foot length with enough mass to carry force. I secured a secondary safety tether around my waist and approached the mast opening again. The figure below managed to latch onto a higher bracket this time, boots scraping against the mast surface. Its movements lacked coordination but not persistence. If it climbed high enough to reach the first intact rung, it would gain leverage. I waited until it committed, until both hands were engaged and its center of gravity shifted upward. Then I dropped the steel rod. Not straight down. Angled. The rod struck the climber's forearm with a dull crack. The grip failed instantly. The body fell backward, colliding with the mast base before collapsing onto the concrete. The sound traveled up the column like a muted drumbeat. The other two figures reacted, not with alarm but with renewed motion. They struck the mast harder, circling it in tight arcs, as if impact itself might create a path. I didn't repeat the drop immediately. Sound discipline mattered. Instead, I watched their behavior. They weren't coordinated in the way armed scavengers would be. They weren't evaluating angle or distance. They were responding to stimulus, noise, movement, vibration. One of them struck the mast again. I responded by dropping the rod a second time, this time targeting the bracket cluster directly beneath the remaining reachable rung. The steel impact rang louder than I intended, but it cleared the potential foothold. Eventually, the figures drifted away. Not because they were deterred, but because something else drew their attention down the street. Silence returned slowly. I resecured the steel rod to its anchor point and inspected every visible bracket from above. Any protrusion within jumping distance would need removal or reinforcement. I logged the encounter in the ration ledger, not out of sentiment but pattern tracking. They had looked up. That meant I could no longer assume invisibility was permanent. 400 feet remained distance. But distance now required active defense. The bodies didn't accumulate all at once. They gathered in increments, drawn by noise, by movement, by whatever impulse still guided them. Most drifted past the crane base and continued down the blocked avenue. A few remained. Those few were enough to change the math. The first time I noticed the difference wasn't visual. It was structural. Tower cranes are designed to flex. They sway under wind load, absorbing force through engineered tolerance rather than resisting it rigidly. That sway is predictable when weight distribution remains balanced. What I felt through the deck that afternoon was not wind. It was irregular oscillation. I stepped to the mast and placed my palm flat against the steel. Subtle vibration pulsed upward, not from gusts, but from repeated impact at the base. Bodies striking metal don't generate significant force individually. But repetition creates rhythm. Rhythm creates transfer. I leaned over carefully and counted. 6 at the base. 2 partially pinned beneath stalled vehicles. 1 wedged between the mast and a concrete barrier, its shoulder jammed against steel. Every time it shifted, it leveraged its own weight into the column. Dead weight becomes live load when it pushes. The crane's counterweights remained balanced against the boom. The mast was anchored at multiple floors. The structure itself was sound, but long-term stress from irregular impact could loosen bolts at lower tie-in points I couldn't see from above. Engineering isn't fear. It's probability. If debris or bodies formed a stable platform beneath the lowest reachable rung, climbing would become possible. If that platform increased leverage against the mast base, vibration could intensify. The solution required descent, partial and controlled. I prepared for it methodically. Safety harness double-clipped. Steel rod secured at my back. Secondary rope coiled at my waist. I removed the hatch brace and descended to the first rest platform inside the mast shaft. From there, I could access the 20-foot gap above ground without fully committing to the street. The air inside the shaft smelled different at lower levels, stale, metallic, carrying faint traces of smoke. I stopped 10 feet above the gap and looked down. 3 bodies lay directly beneath the mast seam, positioned in a way that created height. Not enough to reach the rung yet, but enough to worry me. Using the secondary rope, I lowered the steel rod and hooked it around the nearest torso. Leverage from above works differently than force from below. A steady pull shifted the body sideways. Gravity assisted. It rolled off the small pile and landed clear of the mast. The second took longer. It was partially frozen to the pavement by accumulated ice. I applied short, controlled jerks rather than one hard pull. Eventually, it broke free and slid into the drainage channel along the curb. The wedged figure against the concrete barrier required a different approach. I descended 2 more rungs, maintaining clear distance from the gap, and extended the rod downward to pry its shoulder loose. Once detached, it toppled backward without resistance. Each removal reduced impact potential. Each shift lowered leverage risk. But the operation carried its own danger. Sound echoed inside the shaft. The movement attracted attention. Twice, I saw new figures drift toward the mast as I worked. I froze until they lost interest, then resumed. After clearing the immediate base, I scanned the tie-in bolts at the lowest visible anchoring point. No shear marks. No displacement. Vibration readings, felt through my palm, returned to standard wind sway. I climbed back to the machinery deck slowly, reinstalled the hatch brace, and logged the event alongside ration counts and water collection totals. Below, the street remained unstable. Above, structural integrity held for now. 400 feet was still advantage. But advantage required upkeep. And dead weight, if ignored, becomes collapse. The infected were predictable in their unpredictability. They followed noise, collided with obstacles, and lost interest quickly. Humans did not. Humans evaluated. I saw the truck first, an older pickup navigating the blocked intersection 3 blocks west. It moved slowly, not because it had to, but because its driver chose careful angles through stalled cars. That distinction mattered. When it reached the open stretch beneath the crane, it stopped with intent. 3 men stepped out. They weren't frantic. They weren't running. Each wore layered clothing, heavy boots, gloves. 2 carried rifles slung low across their chests. The third kept a pistol holstered but visible. They scanned rooftops first, not storefronts. That alone separated them from anything else moving on the street. They understood vertical advantage. I extinguished the heater immediately and cut all interior lighting. Even reflected glass glare from the operator cab could betray me at this distance. I crouched behind the insulation barrier and watched through a narrow gap between tarp and mast. The men circled the crane base in widening arcs. One of them craned his neck upward, hand shading his eyes despite the overcast sky. He wasn't looking randomly. He was checking lines, boom angle, cab orientation, possible access points. The 20-foot ladder gap still hung clear. No debris platform remained beneath it. But human ingenuity bridges distance faster than instinct. One of them tested the mast with his boot, striking it lightly. The sound traveled upward, muted but distinct. They were checking for echo, for occupancy. I didn't respond. Silence is a weapon when you hold height. They moved to the stalled vehicles nearest the mast and began shifting them slightly, not clearing the street, just adjusting orientation. Creating space. Creating angle. I realized what they were testing, whether any structure nearby could be repositioned as a stepping platform. The tallest among them climbed onto the hood of a sedan and jumped, fingers stretching toward the lowest bracket. He fell short by several feet. The second man tried from the bed of the pickup. Same result. They weren't reckless. They were measuring. I repositioned the steel rod within arm's reach, but resisted the urge to act. Dropping metal would confirm presence. If they knew someone occupied the crane, the dynamic changed entirely. Rifles extend reach. The man with the pistol stepped back and gestured toward the unfinished building behind the mast. They disappeared from direct view for several minutes. I shifted position cautiously and scanned the upper floors of the structure. Movement appeared in the skeletal frame, boots stepping through open window bays. They were looking for interior access. My earlier inspection had confirmed the crane mast passed through the building core, without direct interior doorways at upper levels. Access required entering the ladder shaft from below. But if they discovered that pathway, they might attempt to fabricate a climb. I moved quickly to the hatch and checked the brace. Secure. Then I climbed halfway down the mast and listened. No metal-on-metal contact. No cutting tools. Just faint voices echoing through concrete corridors. They were exploring. After nearly an hour, the three men re-emerged onto the street. One of them looked up again, longer this time. He raised his rifle, not to fire but to sight along it, aligning barrel with cab position as if imagining trajectory. Then he lowered it. A shot would draw more attention than reward. Eventually, they returned to the pickup and drove off slowly, continuing their deliberate navigation through stalled traffic. I remained still long after they left. Below, chaos stumbled without strategy. Above, silence held. Height had protected me from mindless impact. It would not protect me from calculated return. From this point forward, invisibility mattered more than insulation. And men with rifles had just learned the crane was worth noticing. The storm didn't arrive dramatically. It gathered. By mid-morning, the sky flattened into a colorless sheet that erased depth from the horizon. Wind shifted from restless to purposeful, angling against the boom with sustained pressure rather than passing gusts. I had tracked the forecast for days on the emergency radio, warnings layered beneath static, but hearing about wind and feeling it at 400 feet are separate experiences. The first snow band moved sideways. Not downward. Sideways. It struck the tarp walls in thin, fast streaks that sounded like sand against canvas. Within minutes, exposed steel turned slick. Ice began forming along the mast seams and cable housings. The crane responded as engineered, a long, slow sway, counterweights balancing load. But the oscillation amplitude increased with each stronger gust. Inside the sealed zone, I tightened every ratchet strap anchoring insulation and tarp. Wind is leverage. Leverage finds weakness. I reinforced the windward barrier with an additional layer of insulation bats, compressing them between tarp and railing. That reduced vibration noise and dampened airflow. Below, visibility collapsed quickly. Streets vanished under white sweep. Vehicles became low shapes. Movement at ground level slowed, not from strategy but from friction. Figures attempting to cross intersections stumbled against drifts that formed unpredictably between stalled cars. Snow altered threat patterns. Cold slows muscle response. It stiffens joints. The infected that drifted into the open plaza beneath the crane moved unevenly now, feet dragging through accumulating slush. Some slipped and fell, remaining motionless longer than before. A few did not rise again. But cold also isolates. If I lost heat, if wind compromised insulation, the same physics applied to me. I shifted water containers inward toward the mast and increased insulation along the plywood floor perimeter. I reduced heater burn cycles to preserve propane, but extended each cycle slightly to compensate for falling temperature. Carbon monoxide levels remained stable. The detector stayed silent. Still, I cracked a microvent in the tarp seam opposite the heater to maintain controlled airflow. Mid-afternoon, a stronger gust hit broadside. The boom flexed visibly. I felt it through the deck, an elongated sway that held longer before correcting. Not failure, not instability, but stress at scale. I clipped into the mast anchor and stepped cautiously toward the outer railing. Snow accumulated unevenly along the boom's upper surface. Excess weight at the wrong angle could shift balance tolerances. Using the steel rod, I dislodged heavier clumps before they consolidated into ice sheets. Maintenance doesn't pause for weather. By nightfall, the storm intensified. Wind howled across the boom, harmonizing through cable lines and metal joints. The entire structure hummed like a low-frequency instrument. I lay on the insulated platform, listening to that resonance and mapping it mentally against normal sway patterns. Familiar vibration is survival. Unfamiliar vibration is a warning. Down below, street noise had vanished completely. No horns, no shouting, just wind. The crane became the only living movement in the district, swinging slightly, correcting itself, standing because it was designed to. Snow increased water reserves but erased landmarks. Escape routes that might have existed days earlier were now buried under drifts and frozen debris. Isolation hardened. By dawn, the city resembled a white excavation site, forms reduced to geometry. The storm tapered gradually, leaving behind silence thick enough to feel. I stepped to the edge and surveyed the altered landscape. Bodies lay half-buried along the mast base, frozen into static shapes. Vehicles formed low ridges across intersections. 400 feet remained distance. But now it was distance above winter. And winter tests steel as thoroughly as it tests men. Silence expands in confined space. After the storm passed, the city below remained muted, as if the snow had absorbed more than sound. From the machinery deck, the world felt suspended. No engines, no distant sirens. Even the occasional impact against the mast had diminished. Cold had slowed everything. Isolation sharpened in that quiet. The machinery deck measured barely enough for one person to stretch out fully. With insulation compressed along the windward wall and supplies stacked against the mast, movement required intention. Every turn risked brushing a container or shifting a tarp seam. There was no hallway to walk, no corner to retreat into. I created one. Routine became architecture. Each morning began with inspection. Mast bolts at visible tie-in points, tarp tension lines, heater fittings, water container seals. I logged propane levels in exact increments, not estimates. After inspection came ration count, calories measured against projected days. Then hygiene protocol, wipe down of hands, face, and neck using minimal disinfectant, inspection of skin for abrasions, cleaning of cooking surface, sealing of previous night's waste liner for disposal at first safe opportunity. Discipline replaced space. Without it, thought spirals. Sleep arrived unevenly. The crane's natural sway, once a background sensation, began to intrude during rest. In darkness, even small shifts felt exaggerated. I found myself waking to imagined impacts that never came. The wind altered tone through cable lines, producing brief metallic harmonics that resembled distant footsteps. Each time, I forced myself to verify before reacting. Verification prevents panic. Midweek, I reduced radio scans to 2 brief windows per day to conserve battery and mental bandwidth. Too much static breeds speculation. Too little information breeds assumptions. Balance mattered. I also instituted physical maintenance cycles. Twice daily, I performed controlled movement drills within the confined deck, squats, push-ups against the mast, balance holds near the railing while clipped into safety lines. Muscles degrade quickly without resistance. Weakness at height compounds risk. Contrast remained constant. Below, snowbound streets held frozen disorder. Above, order required active preservation. Panic consumes itself. Discipline consumes nothing if measured correctly. On the 5th night after the storm, I caught myself speaking aloud to the heater during ignition. Not conversation, just commentary on flame stability. The sound of my own voice startled me. It reminded me how little human speech existed at this elevation now. I adjusted. Instead of talking, I wrote. Using the back of a plywood ration board, I logged daily observations beyond numbers. Wind direction shifts, mast vibration anomalies, movement density below, structural sounds after temperature drops. Recording patterns anchored thought in data rather than speculation. No room to pace does not mean no room to think. It means thinking must be structured. By the end of the week, the deck no longer felt like confinement. It felt like a controlled perimeter. Every object had position. Every action had a sequence. Even rest had schedule. Below, frozen bodies marked where momentum had failed. Above, momentum continued, not through motion but through maintenance. 400 feet is not freedom. It is responsibility measured vertically. And responsibility, repeated daily, keeps isolation from becoming collapse. The first thaw didn't arrive as warmth. It arrived dripping. For days, temperatures hovered just above freezing during daylight, then fell back into brittle cold after sunset. Snow on the boom softened, shifted, and slid in uneven sheets that struck the tarp collection system with dull slaps. Meltwater flow increased. That alone changed projections. Winter survival is endurance. Spring demands planning. I extended the water capture system along a longer section of the boom, adding a secondary tarp channel to increase yield during heavy melt. Containers filled faster now. Surplus water meant leverage. Leverage meant options. The unfinished high-rise beneath the crane had exposed rooftop sections 2 floors below the machinery deck. During construction, they had been intended for mechanical installations. Now they were wind-scoured platforms with partial sun exposure. I studied them daily, mapping debris patterns and structural integrity from above. Soil was the missing variable. On my final supply descent weeks earlier, I had noticed large decorative planters near the building's entrance, heavy fiberglass units filled with compacted soil and ornamental shrubs. If I could retrieve even a fraction of that soil and haul it upward, controlled planting might be possible. Food scarcity is slow violence. I built a temporary descent system using a braided rope ladder stored in the supply pile for emergency evacuation. It remained coiled until needed, hidden from sight to preserve the illusion of permanent isolation. On a calm morning, after extended observation confirmed minimal movement below, I lowered the rope ladder just enough to reach the mechanical floor, never fully to street level. From there, I accessed interior stairwells to reach the rooftop platform 2 levels down. The building's skeleton remained quiet. No recent disturbance. I hauled 2 5-gallon buckets of soil upward, using the pulley system I had refined during earlier supply lifts. It took 3 controlled runs to accumulate enough soil to fill a shallow grow bed constructed from spare insulation wrapping and scrap sheet metal. Seeds were improvised. Dried beans from ration stores, lentils, anything capable of sprouting. Nutritional yield would be limited, but even minor growth extends psychological endurance. I positioned the grow bed along the sun-facing edge of the rooftop platform, secured against wind, and rigged a drip irrigation line from the meltwater collection system. Gravity fed the soil at measured intervals. Excess runoff drained away from structural seams. Solar adaptation followed. I salvaged 2 portable job site battery packs and mounted small reflective panels from construction debris along the boom to increase exposure. Power generation would never replace stored energy entirely, but incremental recharge cycles reduced dependence on finite fuel. Escape contingency evolved as well. The rope ladder system remained viable, but I added a controlled release descent line anchored at the machinery deck, a rapid exit method if fire or structural failure forced evacuation. The stored harness remained clipped and ready. Isolation should never eliminate retreat planning. From above, the city showed signs of slow transformation. Snow receded from intersections, revealing abandoned vehicles in hardened clusters. Movement patterns changed again. Fewer erratic wanderers, more sporadic human scouting parties at distance. Spring doesn't erase collapse. It exposes it. 400 feet above the street, I monitored new variables. Sunlight angle shifts, water yield rates, wind direction trends. Growth in the soil bed appeared within 10 days, thin green shoots pushing through dark earth. Proof of continuity. Below, asphalt cracked under temperature change. Above, controlled life pushed upward by design. Height had preserved me through winter. Adaptation would determine how long I remained there. And spring, unlike snow, does not forgive stagnation. The signal cut through during a routine scan. I kept radio use minimal. 2 windows daily, short bursts, rotating frequencies to conserve battery and avoid pattern predictability. Most days delivered nothing but static layered with distant interference. That morning just after sunrise, a voice threaded through the noise. Secured perimeter, outer district checkpoint, limited intake. The signal wavered, then strengthened. If you can hear this, move north along the river corridor. Avoid main bridges. Repeat, I adjusted the dial carefully, fine-tuning the frequency until the transmission stabilized. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't a lone scavenger broadcasting false hope. It sounded structured, disciplined, coordinates repeated twice, instructions measured, a fortified zone outside city limits. Community implies risk. I lowered the radio and stepped to the deck railing. 400 feet offered perspective, but perspective had boundaries. I could see smoke plumes thinning across downtown. I could see vehicle clusters frozen in permanent gridlock. I could see small human movement at distance, groups traveling cautiously along open corridors. What I couldn't see was north, along the river, beyond the city's edge. Height had been a strategy. Isolation had been a protection. But protection calcifies if never reassessed. I inventoried resources mentally. Water capture stable. Food stores reduced, but supplemented by rooftop growth. Propane at 60%. Structural integrity intact. Rope ladder and descent line functional. Solar recharge cycles extending battery life modestly. Leaving would mean descending into density again. Even with spring thaw reducing ice hazards, the streets remained obstacle courses of metal and uncertainty. The rope ladder could reach the mechanical floor safely, but beyond that, ground commitment would be total. Staying meant predictability, control, routine, but permanence at elevation carries its own erosion. One injury without assistance would end everything. One unforeseen structural failure would eliminate escape. I replayed the broadcast in my head. Limited intake. That phrase mattered. It suggested organization under strain, not chaos masquerading as order. It suggested triage, not desperation. From below, a distant engine noise echoed faintly, rare, controlled. I scanned west and spotted a small convoy navigating through thawed corridors, moving deliberately along what appeared to be a cleared route. The world was shifting again. Height had shielded me from collapse's initial violence. Winter had tested endurance. Spring demanded choice. I returned to the grow bed and checked the seedlings. Thin stems held steady against light wind, rooted in soil I had hauled upward by decision. Survival had been vertical engineering. Community would be horizontal negotiation. I powered the radio back on and logged the frequency precisely in the ledger board. For now, I remained where I was. 400 feet still offered an advantage. But advantage without reassessment becomes arrogance. And somewhere north of the river, someone else had built walls that did not sway. The radio frequency remains written on the plywood board beside my ration log. I test it once each day, always at different hours, never long enough to form a pattern. Sometimes the voice returns, brief, structured, disciplined. Sometimes there is only static. I have not descended. 400 feet still offers clarity the ground cannot. From here, I watch thaw reshape the city in slow increments. Streets that once held frozen bodies now hold emptier space. Fires have burned out. Smoke no longer stains the horizon. Movement below exists, but it is cautious now, measured rather than frantic. The crane remains stable. Mast boats hold. Counterweights remain balanced. The grow bed continues to produce thin, steady growth. Water capture outpaces daily need. Propane reserves remain within margin. Isolation is no longer reaction. It is position. If I leave, it will not be because panic forces me. It will be because probability shifts in favor of movement. Until then, elevation remains defense, visibility remains leverage, and routine remains survival. The ladder stays cut, and I am still above the street.